Good morning, everyone. I wanted to give you all some feedback on your work on Module 3. So I'm going to do a couple of videos to go through the different activities that you completed last week, since there were 3 activities and I don't want to have a 20-minute video, so we'll just have a couple shorter videos to give you all some feedback and some general comments on that work. So I wanted to start off with activity 3.1, and that was the activity where you looked at 3 different lessons and brainstormed how you could make it more student-centered. So to start with lesson A, that one was on crediting sources. And to make that one more student-centered, there were a lot of things that you could do. A lot of you identified most of these. Adding an objective, you could eliminate the poll and use the discussion as a hook, or you could keep the poll and then tie the lesson back into citation managers at the end of class, and noting that those tools could help avoid some of the issues that you discussed during the lesson. And then you could also use that as an opportunity to push students to tutorials or LibGuides or workshops that you have that are using those particular tools, and then you don't need to actually cover that in class. You could also add a discussion or in small group or pairs to brainstorm to define scholarship before you give the definition. You could ask the class or have a discussion about what they think the consequences might be for crediting sources. So instead of you telling them outright what the consequences are, ask them to think about it first and come up with some ideas. And instead of showing an example of a scandal, maybe provide different short case studies for students to read and discuss in small groups, or in addition to, use that scandal case as a hook in the beginning of the lesson. And that was one of the best responses that I got from this activity, or from this lesson, lesson A, was to using the idea of a scandal as a case study as a hook at the beginning of the lesson. So instead of saving all of that for the end, using that right at the beginning to get students interested and engaged. For lesson B, that lesson was reading citations, and some ideas for making that one more student-centered would be to have students discuss in the large group, small groups, or pairs why they think citing is important. Give them a guided worksheet or an online scavenger hunt to find resources that can help them with citations. Have the students create a list of common elements that could be included in most citations. You could do that as a game in small groups, something with post-it notes, do a think, pair, share, or ask the students to identify a type of source based on example citations. And again, you could do that in large groups, small groups, a game, or through using a worksheet. So a lot of these different ideas, you can design an activity, and then to create that balance between individual small group and large group activities, most of these things can be done any of those different ways. So you just want to find a balance. So if you're having them start off in a large group, then maybe break off into smaller groups for activity 2, and then do something individually for activity 3, and then bring it back to a large group for activity 4, or some kind of combination. So you want to make sure that you have that blend of different types of work. And one of the best responses from you all was to create a formative assessment activity or game where teams compete to see which team can identify the types of sources based on the citations the fastest. And maybe you have some kind of prize or candy or something to give them afterwards that would work really well with undergraduate students, I think. And then lesson C, to make that one more student-centered, that one was on crediting sources. In that lesson, you could have the students, again in large groups, small groups, or pairs, brainstorm the differences between primary or secondary sources. You could ask the students to think of examples of different types of primary and secondary sources before you show the examples. So make them think of something first before you kind of confirm their ideas with your examples. And then have the students make a list of common elements to consider when determining whether a source is primary or secondary. Some of the good responses from you all were having, again, the students provide their own examples, but having them pull examples from their everyday life. And that could kind of help with engagement and also help with that idea of the macro versus micro. The micro, they need to know the difference between these things right now for this class, but how does that apply to the bigger picture, to their everyday lives? You could also do a scavenger hunt of sorts where students find items that meet the requirements that either you've given them or they've created for primary and secondary sources. And Going back to the idea of a hook, adding a hook about why it's relevant to them, having them work in groups to determine if they are primary or secondary, maybe even a card sort or a concept map. I really like the idea of a concept map. I just read an article on concept mapping last week on why we should do them for lots of different activities and how they help the brain process information in different ways. We think of concept mapping, we think, oh, that's a creative process. I can only do that with creative groups. Well, that's not true. It's good for everybody. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to post that reading. It was really interesting and made me think about concept maps in a little bit of a different way. Even though I already use them, it was a really helpful article. So I really like that idea of a concept map. Overall, you all did pretty well on this activity 3.1, but I did want to give you some words of caution, particularly for that last lesson, Lesson C. One idea was to incorporate a Jeopardy game, and which is a great idea. I love that idea. But to even go for tertiary if you really want to get them going. And I definitely see the appeal of that, of adding tertiary into that discussion of primary and secondary sources. However, the objective of Lesson C was that students can distinguish between primary and secondary sources. Tertiary is not mentioned in the objective. We want to make sure that we keep our content, materials, and activities aligned, because this is where we get into trouble with wanting to give students everything we can, giving them more and more information, but we really want to stay focused. If the objective is to distinguish between primary and secondary, don't even say the word tertiary, unless they ask, in which case, of course, answer that question, but stay focused on the objectives. If the students don't need to know about tertiary right then, just let it go. But some general comments. Remember, I kind of mentioned this earlier, student-centered learning should have a blend of large group, small group, and individual activities. Many of you really jumped on that group activity thing, which is great. That's an easy way to kind of get into the habit of incorporating different types of learning activities. But remember, you do want to have that blend and give students an opportunity to engage in a large group, but also the time to work on their own as individuals as well. Because group learning is definitely necessary for student learning, but it shouldn't be the only way that students engage. And someone mentioned that they thought group work would be difficult because the students tend to spread out in the room and they don't sit near each other. And I would say don't let the physical space be an excuse. You can control it. Ask them to move. You don't have to keep them where they sit just because they sit there. I know you guys can't tell because in these videos I'm usually sitting down, but I'm pretty short. I'm under 5 feet tall, so if I'm in a room where the computer is in a location where it's going to block me from view, I use a clicker and I move around, but sometimes I do need to be up at that computer, so I don't let students sit in the seats right in front of that podium, because then I can't see them and they can't see me, and I'm not comfortable with that, so I make the students move. And I'm constantly asking them to move too, or not constantly, but I frequently ask them to move to get into groups, to work together, to turn around and talk to the person next to them. Don't worry about the students not actually sitting next to each other. Make them move. This is your classroom. You can get them to do that. Don't let the physical space be a barrier to what you want them to do in the classroom. Engagement. There were some comments on engagement that I wanted to address. And remember that engagement does not mean that the students are awake. Engagement means that they are actively engaging in the learning process. They are doing activities, they are reflecting on their learning, they are creating information. So take a look back at the slides that I posted on the resources wiki about engagement, because you want to go a little bit further than, I know the students were engaged because they were answering my questions. Not quite engagement. That means that they are paying attention, but that doesn't mean that they are actively engaged in the learning process. And finally, think about switching your wording and your perspective a little bit. Anytime a lesson plan has something that says you show or I show or the librarian shows or the librarian or I explain, meaning you, the librarian, what you are doing, think about how you can flip that. Anytime you can change librarian says, librarian explains, librarian demonstrates, anytime you can flip that to the students show, the students explain, the students demonstrate, that's a really easy way to flip your lesson and make it into a more student-centered lesson. You want the students to be engaging, you want the students to be doing the work, so look for those clues in your lesson plan. Anytime you write I, meaning yourself, or librarian, see if you can change that and see if the students can do the work. We want to give them credit for what they already know and what they can do and figure out. So let them try things before you just give them the information. One of the things that really baffles me where I work right now, I've worked with both the School of Education and the School of Arts and Sciences, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And it baffles me that sometimes faculty just give students all the resources they need and have them write a synthesis paper. And it's not because they want to save time in the semester or because they really want the students to reflect on those particular resources, but it's because they honestly don't believe that their students are capable of conducting a literature search and finding quality information on their own. It's difficult, but it can be done. And to not give students even a chance to try and learn is really confusing to me. So make sure that you're not being that faculty member, that you're not being that person who doesn't give the students enough credit about what they already know and what they can do. Students are there to learn, so let's do what we can to help them, and sometimes that doesn't mean just spoon feeding them the information. So try to change your lessons from a focus on what you are doing to a focus on what they are doing. And the last thing I wanted to mention in this video for the 3.1 activity feedback, and this is going to apply to all activities and assignments moving forward, please keep your short answer responses short. Let's try 250 words or less. I know you all seem to be learning a lot and you have a lot to say, but let's try to cut it down a little bit and keep it short to 250 words. That way you can focus on what's important and I can see what you're really getting out of it and what's most important to you. So any activity, discussion board can be a little bit longer if you'd like, but for activities and assignments that you're turning in, please keep your responses to 250 words or less. But overall, you guys did great on activity 3.1, and I'm going to do another video for activity 3.2 shortly. So keep up the good work, and I'll talk to some of you soon.